Welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight Series. We are a 501c3 research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss interesting facts about each species. This is our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy the series, and be sure to follow us on Instagram to vote for which animal we talk about next. And without further ado, welcome to the PacMam podcast. I'm Cindy.
I'm Kat.
And I'm Trevor.
And this week, I'm excited about it because we are going to do a marine mammal highlight. And this one is about right whales. And I'm going to spoil one of Kat's fun things just for a minute, because the reason why we're doing this and the reason why we didn't have a poll up for choosing which one we're going to do this week is because we just got super excited because we just saw a North Pacific, well, we didn't, but our friends.
I'm going to say we
Canada,
specifically didn't, sadly.
I mean, the collective we of marine mammal people. Up in Canada, they saw a North Pacific right whale, which, as you'll find out in the episode, is very, very rare. So we got super excited. So we said, you know what, we're going to do right whales this week. And we'll talk more about that sighting later. But I think Trevor's going to start us off with, and we have, there's three different species of right whales. There's the North Pacific, the North Atlantic, and the Southern right whale. So they're very similar in many ways. So we're going to talk about kind of all of them and just give you little tidbits about each population as appropriate. So Trevor's going to start us off.
Okay, so there used to just be two species of right whale, the northern right whale and the southern right whale. But in 2008, researchers finally decided that the northern right whale is actually two separate species. They look incredibly similar, but they actually have to use genetic data to prove that they're two different species. Cool. So I will kind of just explain what they look like first, because they look virtually identical until you get to some nitty-gritty stuff. But right whales in general, they're pretty big. They lack a dorsal fin in the back, so that's pretty distinctive from them. But probably the biggest recognizable feature with them is their head and their callosities. So callosities are essentially like big calluses, I guess you could say, like on your hands and feet. You have those.
Yeah, like colossities. Yeah.
Yeah. Or yeah, exactly.
Is that potato? I'm not sure.
I was going to say, I think it might be colossities just with the way they spell it, but
yeah,
actually, well, maybe not. I don't know.
I don't know. That's the way I read it. I say callosities. So
either way, callosities, colossities.
I trust you. Both the northern Pacific right whale and the northern Atlantic right whale, which is what they decided to name the two species, have those colossities, I should say. And they are pretty much perfect spots for sea lice, or whale lice, I should say. But those are the most identifiable features of those whales. But their head is massive as well. So I think it's about a quarter of their body length.
I think I read up to a third.
Yeah.
Up to a third? Okay.
Yeah. It's giant. They have big heads.
They have a really, really, really arched jawline too. So if you look at the skull of a right whale, it's just incredibly arched in that jawline. The tail is really, really broad too, with a deep notch. So that's one way to identify it. It's just if you just see the fluke coming up, especially when they're in the same area as humpbacks and gray whales, for example, if you just see that huge broad tail with a deep notch. But size-wise, here's like kind of the main difference between the northern Pacific and northern Atlantic right whale. They're up to 60 feet long in the Pacific. And up to 180,000 pounds, with some recorded to 220,000 pounds.
Wow.
Which, for reference, humpbacks are only 10 feet shorter than that at the max, and that's twice their weight.
Oh my gosh.
They're a bit rotund.
Yeah. And then the northern Atlantic right whale gets up to 52 feet, 154,000 pounds is the max. So
actually quite a bit smaller.
Yeah. So they look pretty much the same. It's just different size, I guess. Then range wise, the northern Atlantic right whale it's pretty heavily studied and dwindling. They basically migrate from the Labrador Sea up in Canada, And then they travel south along the coast to their calving grounds in Georgia and Florida in the western stalk of the Atlantic Ocean. And there's about 360 left, I think was the last count.
Yeah, the last I saw was under 400.
Yeah, which I'll get into in this data section as well.
Okay. And then there's an eastern stalk too, technically, what migrates from northern Europe down to the Sahara, which has a much lesser population, which I'm sure Kat will get into. And then the northern Pacific right whale has two different stalks as well. Their main area for feeding grounds are in the Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska. And then they travel down, we think, to warmer waters. I know they've seen them in Hawaii and Baja before. And then the western stalk goes to the Sea of Okhotsk, I think.
Okhotsk, yeah, something like that. And over in Japan.
Yeah. But we really only know they used to be way more numerous based on our previous whaling logs, but those logs are,
I think I read, I don't know, and maybe I'm going to step on Kat's toes here, but it was like over 10,000 or something. And now there's like 500.
It was a huge amount.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Kat will explain why they're called the right whale as well.
Spoiler alert. We're going to get into some good stuff.
And then the southern right whale, which is down basically around Antarctica, and it'll travel up north, kind of like their classic humpback migration, north to Australia, South America, etc. They're basically the same size as well. They are maximum 60 feet and 80 tons. Up to 90 tons was the record. And they also have those colossities as well.
So they're almost similar in size to the Pacific.
Right.
One.
But they look pretty much the same.
Yeah, like they're all right whales and they all look the same. They're just slightly different sizes. Medium, small, large. Cool. And so I don't know if Kat found it, and I didn't look at it, but it's interesting to me that there's the North Pacific, the North Atlantic, and then just the southern.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean they do have different stocks in the southern, but as far as I could find, there was no delineation about like, oh, the Australian ones are called a different species. Like it's all the same, considered the same species in the southern hemisphere. It's just they're split into slightly different stocks. And I couldn't really find a lot on the other stocks. It was mostly information about the Australian waters.
Right. Yeah, that's the only one I kind of saw too. They're like southern right whale, but over here.
That's where, again, spoiler alert for later, but that is where the vast majority of them seem to go, is in the Australian waters. So that's what we just have more information on.
Interesting.
I guess the northern and the northern Pacific and Atlantic, it kind of makes sense for the different species because they've been separated by that massive landmass, which allows them to diversify a little bit, versus down south, they can circumnavigate Antarctica if they really wanted to. And that whole ocean's connected, even though they're stopped. But yeah,
these guys are isolated.
Yeah, whenever that isolation happens, you're more likely to get a speciation over time because they just live in different places.
Yeah, cool.
All right, well, I'm gonna head on into diet and behavior. I think that's what you got, Trevor, right?
Yep, that should be good for me.
Sweet. So I'm gonna kind of talk about all of them and then pick out the pieces, because again, they're all right whales and they're all fairly similar and they all kind of do the same thing. But there were some differences in what we've observed behavior-wise. And I think a lot of that actually comes down to being able to observe them in the first place. So we don't have a lot of information on the North Pacific for obvious reasons that we'll talk about. But so these are, like any large baleen whale species, they are filter feeders. They eat very, very small things. They love zooplankton, which are the little microscopic and a little bit bigger. You can see them, but they're still really small. Animals, right? So zooplankton versus phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are the little plants. Zooplankton are the little animals that float around in the water. And so mainly they like these tiny little crustaceans called copepods, euphausids, and cyprids. And I think the euphausids are like shrimp-like, and the cyprids were, I think, barnacle larvae is what I could find. And the copepods are just like little crustaceans. they didn't have one that was like, they look like this. So, but they feed differently than most other baleen whale species. So I think what most people are used to seeing are like humpbacks. where they do the lunge feeding. So they come down from below and they open their mouth and they lunge out of the water and then kick all the water and the fish and whatnot in their mouths, and then push that out with their tongue and filter out the organisms. But these guys are different. They do what's called ram or skim feeding. And so what they do is they basically just open their mouth. I kind of like I was thinking it was kind of like a shark when it's like, na 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 na, you know, but they'll just open their mouth and just swim like that.
Interesting.
As they catch the stuff that they're trying to catch. And so what's interesting though is I think about that at the surface. Like you would see like just the top of the roof of their mouth just floating by, and that would look really weird. But they can do that in the water column. They can do it from the bottom to the top.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so they can do that kind of anywhere. And I thought this is really interesting is that they like zooplankton, which can be as large as a grain of rice.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Huge. And these guys are what, like 90, up to 90 tons or one of the species.
Right.
So wild.
And like so they actually can eat up to 2,200 to 5,500 pounds of food per day. Do you know how many grains of rice that is? That's a lot. It's just crazy. But the other thing that's unique then also is because of the way they feed, their baleen has to be different than the lunge feeders. So the lunge feeders baleen is around 3 feet. And these guys, the right whales and the bowheads are up to 7 to 8 feet long.
Wow.
Yeah, and a very different texture and what it looks like because they're feeding in a slightly different way on slightly different things, but super, super small.
Mm-hmm.
So going on to behavior, they are really, really, really slow. That's like one of the most, every time you read something like, they're really slow, they're really slow.
Yeah, I think one thing I read was like they're one of the slowest swimming whales.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And I think they're just so big. You can't, with that big rotund body, you're not going to be speeding through. Like, it's not.
Yeah, that's a lot of friction going through the water.
A lot of drag.
Yeah.
Yeah. But despite that, they can be very active at the surface. So most of the species will breach, which I think is kind of crazy too, because it takes a lot of energy to get that body out of the water to be able to lift it up and breach. But apparently it's fun enough that they do it. And then they have what's called surface active groups. And this is what I could find. They noted this for the North Atlantic right whale. And again, I think most of this behavior comes from the North Atlantic and the southern right whale, because we know about them much more than we do the Pacific, because there are so few individuals in the Pacific population. So they call these surface groups, they call them surface active groups. And this is where you'll see mating and socializing. And this happens in all seasons and habitats. So they just have parties every once in a while and have a good time, which is nice to see. They communicate through low frequency moans, groans, pulses, and those can maintain contact between individuals. They can communicate threats, signal aggression, any other social things. So they can talk to each other, which is pretty cool. So the southern right whales, though, there were more descriptions of specific behaviors that I could find. And so they will breach. They'll also lobtail. So that's lifting the fluke out of the water and then flopping it over. Flippering, which I've never heard it called this before, but that's slapping the water with their pectoral flippers.
Interesting. They don't call it peck slapping?
Apparently, like, though this one that I found said flippering.
Huh.
So I was like, okay. And I'm pretty sure, I think that was from Noah. But yeah, I was, cool. with humpback whales, I was just, you say, oh, they just peck slap.
Right. And same with like orcas and anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So they call it flippering. And the last one, this one's so cool. They sail. So they'll basically do a headstand, stick their tail up in the air, and then let the wind blow their tails.
What? No way.
Yeah, like, yes.
Dude, can you imagine if you saw that? Just this huge whale fluke just like cruising at the surface.
And what if you had a group of them? Like there's just this group of tails. Is like,
that is so crazy.
Like, and why? I mean,
I guess if you're that slow, it might actually be faster than you swimming. That's lower energy, so it makes total sense.
Well, that's
But
true. They don't
how
have
did
to
you
swim.
figure
They're
that
just,
out?
I mean, you have to keep your tail up, but
Right.
It's probably
yeah,
fun.
Right. Yeah.
It'd be
True.
fun. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
I saw
That's
the
gnarly.
I think I saw the southern right whale does it far more than the two northern species too.
That's what I'm
Oh,
saying. Like
interesting.
I only saw these
Oh yeah,
specific
okay.
papers are only listed for southern right whales. So
Hmm.
maybe the wind's better down there. I don't
Right.
know.
Or again, because they are more well observed. Maybe it's just because
Right,
we've seen it more there.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I was thinking about is if these guys are having trouble finding food in the North Pacific or North Atlantic versus the Southern, these guys, the Southern just might have more time to do these behaviors.
Right.
We talk about that in the Bahamas where we have spotted and bottlenose dolphins, and the bottlenose dolphins just have to eat more. They're bigger, and we see more play behaviors with the spotted dolphins.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it could be some just they don't do the behaviors in front of us. There's that, but it may be that they just have to spend more time eating. So
Right.
maybe the southern
And
right whales don't
allocation.
have to. Yeah.
Huh. Cool.
Possibilities. Reproduction wise, we know not that much. Right whale species in general, the females seem to give birth around 9 to 10 years of age. So they might mate at like 8 or 9 and then give birth for the first time there. They have a 12 to 13 month gestation period, and they nurse for about a year, and then they'll calve every 3 to 5 years. But what's really interesting, and Kat will talk about it with the status, this interval may be increasing to every 6 to 10 years due to the anthropogenic stressors like entanglement and vessel strikes that are causing so many issues. And this also affects the sex ratio. So in some of the populations there, and I think like the North Atlantic, there are over twice as many females than there are males. And
interesting.
that's kind of a problem.
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, not females. There's twice as many males than there are
I was
females.
going to say it's the other way around.
It's the other way around. Just kidding. It's early. So if you have a ton of males, you don't need as many males as you do females because the females are the ones that give birth and take care of the young. So you kind of need them. So that's a problem.
Right.
But some behaviors that they do, it's super cute. I saw this for the North Atlantic right whales. The calves may swim on, oh no, actually this was for the Pacific, which was interesting. The calves may swim on their mom's back or butt them with their heads. Can you imagine, like little head butters? The mom may roll over on the back and hold the calf between their flippers.
Oh,
like if you can see
it's
that.
like a sea otter.
I know, it was so cute. The only thing I could find in the males, they didn't have a lot about like when they become sexually mature. I don't know if we know. It's harder to know for males because you don't have a physical thing that says, here, I gave birth, so obviously I'm sexually mature. But one thing that's interesting is they have the largest testicles in all of the animal world.
Bam.
Does anybody want to guess how much one weighs?
Oh, are we doing in pounds here?
Yeah, pounds or tons or whatever, yeah.
Oh, we're going as far as tons. Wow.
Right.
1 ton.
It is 1 ton.
Oh, I was right. Wow.
Yes.
That's terrifying.
Each one can weigh 1 ton. It's insane.
God.
Wow. That's a lot. I mean,
like,
just can you imagine just carrying that weight around?
Right.
I can't imagine.
Lifting that out of the water to breach.
Oh my gosh. Never mind the rest of your huge body. Wow.
Right. No, just that alone.
That's crazy.
So that was the fun and interesting thing I found out about males. So
does that make them fairly competitive then? Like, is that a big deal for males then?
Yeah, so that, I mean, the size of that does go into sperm competition, and the larger they are, the likely that is, and that that means that they'll mate with a lot of females, most likely, to try to outcompete. So that's likely what they do. Have a lot of it, you can do a lot of it, and hopefully some of it gets through. The last thing I have is about going with the migration routes. They mostly know the migration routes for the North Atlantic and the southern right whale species, as Trevor already talked about. Again, we know very little about the North Pacific species. But basically, they calve in the low latitude warm waters, and then they migrate to colder waters to feed during the summer months and early fall. And the only calving ground that they know for the North Atlantic right whale, and I couldn't find it they didn't say anything for the southern. I don't know if we know it. I couldn't find anything, and we don't know it for the North Pacific. but was, as Trevor mentioned, was the northern Florida, Georgia, Carolinas. That's kind of where they calf. But I thought it was interesting that that's the only place that we know that they calf, at least that I could find. So we know quite a bit about some of these animals, but we don't know quite a bit about them. And Kat's going to talk about why, because so many died.
Yeah, there's multiple reasons.
Right.
So with that, why don't we take a quick break and then we can get into the status and fun facts.
Excellent. We'll be right back.
Okay, so for the status and threat section, for the status, I'm going to go through each one individually, and then for the threats, we'll kind of talk, they're very similar threats for all three species. So I'll kind of just talk about the threats generally and then mention specific pieces of information. So for the North Atlantic right whale, in terms of status, these guys are highly endangered, listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And as Cindy already mentioned, there's estimated, I think the last count was around 360 individuals in the Western stock, with fewer than 100 breeding females.
Yeah, that was a big thing. It's like,
yeah,
that's
and like, you know, like you said, we'll get into why. And in the Eastern stock, it's estimated there's only around 30 individuals in the Eastern stock. That was the number that I could find.
In the Atlantic?
This is of the North, the North Atlantic right whale, because there's those two stocks, right?
Yeah.
The Eastern stock is not doing well at all. Nor is Western stock, but
but even worse.
Still slightly more of them.
Perspective.
And the North Atlantic right whale has been undergoing what they call an unusual mortality event, a UME, since 2017. So that means that more individuals are dying than would be considered normal background rate of death. And again, we'll get into why in the threats section. For the North Pacific right whales, these guys are actually one of the rarest of all marine mammals. They have been listed as endangered again under the ESA and depleted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The exact population is unknown for the North Pacific right whale, but it's likely to be in the low hundreds. But again, it's hard to tell because we don't really have a good handle on where these guys are most of the time.
So I have, when I was looking at, I saw that it was less than 500, but specifically for our Eastern North Pacific stock, there's less than 30.
Yeah, I was going to get to that.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That was my next sentence.
You just said, okay.
I was pausing for effect.
Oh, oops.
So yeah, there's only about 30 individuals thought to make up the Eastern stock, and those are the animals that we see in our Alaskan waters or northern Canada on the west coast of the US here, or west coast of Canada.
Right, so that's why I made it so exciting that they recently saw one.
Correct. And again, when you are, it's hard, if you are in the US, it is hard sometimes to think about the North Pacific, not just including our waters, but you know, remember, this is going all the way across to, like, you know, Japan and I guess Eastern Asia. turned around when you're thinking about a globe.
I know. Well, I always get confused when you say like Eastern and Western, but it's, it's the Eastern Pacific, but that's the Western US.
Correct. And then again, for the southern right whales, they're also listed as endangered under the ESA and depleted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The only good count that I could find was just for individuals in Australian waters. And obviously there are some other individuals that travel further afield than that. But I think, again, these are just the individuals that we have a good count for. And they're thought to be around 3,500. So they are doing slightly better than either the North Atlantic or the North Pacific right whales. Some populations are slowly recovering after historical whaling, but it's very slow.
Yeah, but I mean,
certain populations are not
3,500 compared to 500. I mean, that's huge difference.
Yeah.
And I was seeing that too, that they're basically like, the southern right whales have been, increasing, maybe not fast, but
right,
they're doing better. So
and that's one of those things where, again, it is like there are still certain populations that are not recovering, and they are very concerned about them.
Right.
But yeah, on the whole, the picture is looking more promising than it is either of the northern species. Okay, so with that, let's get into why there are so few of these animals. So first of all, as we already talked about, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit right now to one of my fun facts, which is why they are called the right whales. As we've been teasing you guys with right along.
This is one of my favorites.
So this is one that I think a lot of people think is an urban legend, but is actually true. So these are called the right whales because they were literally, in historical whaling times, these were known as the right whales to kill. So before they even knew what the species was, they were like, oh, those whales, those are the right ones. Those are the ones you want to target. And the reason is that these ones float when they're killed. So if you can imagine, after hours and hours of hunting whales, if the animal you're hunting floats to the surface, that's so much easier to recover and haul back to your vessel when you're rowing back. I mean, you think about like in the 1800s where this was, happening most vigorously. And because they're so slow and they're easy to chase too.
That's what I was saying when I heard, like, okay, they're so slow. I'm like, oh, well, that it's also a reason why they did it.
Yeah. And they're a large whale with a large head, which means they have a lot of oil that could be used for, lamps and various other things, and a lot of meat that could be processed as well. So the majority of the whaling effort, the commercial whaling effort, targeted right whales for decades.
Yeah.
And there were literally like tens of thousands of animals killed. I mean, I don't think they even have like a great number because there were just so many. And it was, I mean, I did read for the southern right whale, at one point there were thought to be between 55 and 70,000 animals. And now we're down to 3,500-ish.
Jeez.
And this is after some recovery. I mean, this is after like, a few decades of being able to actually recover the populations. So historically, whaling was the number one threat for these guys and is what completely decimated all three populations. And as expected, most of the threats are anthropogenic threats, even today. So the number one threat that we're going to talk about here is entanglement. This is the biggest issue for the North Arctic right whales, but obviously is a major threat for all three. For the North Pacific, I did find that they haven't had too many cases of entanglements that they've observed, mostly just because it's so hard to find these animals. They have had a couple instances in the Western stock. But what's interesting is for the North Pacific right whale, a lot of times they'll actually use the bowhead whale, which also inhabits those same waters, as a proxy, because they're a similar size-ish. They're hunting in similar areas and for similar food, and they have had multiple issues of entanglement with bowhead whales. So it's a fairly reasonable guess that the North Pacific right whale suffers from entanglement as well. And when we say entanglement, this is, we're talking about fishing gear pretty much. Obviously marine debris in general, but fishing gear is one of the main issues for especially the North Atlantic right whale, because in its local habitat, there's a huge fishery for lobster, for crab, and a lot of these fisheries that require lines going down to pots, or just lines in the water in general. And again, for these slow swimmers hunting in the water column, they kind of just swim when they're, I have seen images of them too when they're swimming, where like they kind of just swim like a plane almost, and they're really slow. So their width is going to catch in those lines. And if you have a densely fished area with a ton of lines down, and whales are trying to inhabit that same area, they're just going to be swimming through this myriad of lines and getting hooked on them, and they can't get it off their pec fins, basically.
I saw a really good video. I don't remember where it was, but there is a video. They had like an animated whale to show how, and you said like they're like an airplane, and then they might tilt or roll, and then and there's so many of them that they just get totally entangled.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in the North Atlantic right whale, it's estimated that over 85% of the North Atlantic right whales have been entangled at least once in their lives. And again, we're not talking about that many animals here, right? So, I mean, that's a huge number of the population. And as Cindy mentioned earlier, it's thought that these chronic entanglements are one of the main reasons that females are having fewer calves and taking longer to have them. So if you imagine, if you're weighed down, these are already big animals. If you're weighed down by hundreds of pounds worth of lines over your lifetime that you can't get off you, you're already a slow swimming animal. It's going to be even harder to swim forward because you're being pulled down by these weighted lines who are wrapped around you. You can't forage as well. You can't necessarily migrate successfully or as quickly. There are so many knock-on effects that cause negative implications for their life history and for their ability to have calves. Because like most females, if your body is in a state of stress, typically the body is like, nope, you need to take care of yourself. You're not able to have a kid right now. That's not a wise thing.
Yep.
So again, it actually has much larger implications for the population because of this effect on reproduction.
Yeah. Well, and there it takes so much to nurse and to be pregnant, like so much more calories, that if you can't get it before or during or after, like it's going to be a problem.
Right. And that's the thing, because this has such a problem for their foraging capability. So entanglements are the main issue for these guys, and we'll get into some more positive news about this in the fun facts part, but I just wanted to kind of lay the groundwork that this is a huge problem for this particular whale species. And what also ties into that is vessel strikes. So this is another major source of threat for all three species, but again, specifically the North Atlantic and North Pacific right whales. They're already slow moving, right? So you can't get out of the way of boats very quickly. And if you're tied down with all these lines that you're entangled in, you're even less mobile in the water column, right? So you don't have that maneuverability. Perhaps your pec fins are all tangled up, so you can't actually like turn or roll because you're using your pec fins to do that. If they're stuck with lines, you can't do that very well. So vessel strikes are a big source of danger for these guys. They're, especially in the North Atlantic and North Pacific right whales, their habitat and migration routes are close to major oceanic shipping routes as well, especially in the North Atlantic, where we know a little bit more about what those routes are. And so they're coexisting with these huge ocean going vessels most of the time. So they're just in proximity to them, and again, they can't get out of the way very quickly, so they are more at risk of vessel strikes. And tying into the entanglements again a little bit, but another anthropogenic issue is climate change. So as we've been talking about in most of these marine mammal highlights, climate change is affecting all of these species. But for the right whale specifically, the North Atlantic right whale has actually been changing their distribution significantly over the last 10 years. And they think it's mostly in response to prey distribution. So again, if you're that big, you got to follow the food, right? You have to go where you can eat.
5,500 pounds a day.
Yeah, you kind of need, and you're that size, like you need to be able to eat reliably.
Right.
So from what they've found with studying this, it seems that the prey has moved into areas that were historically less protected for right whales, or areas that are more heavily trafficked by vessels. So they're at greater risk of ship strike if they go to those areas. So the prey is moving into less than desirable locations, at least for the North Atlantic right whale. And those shifts are likely to continue, which again, for these guys, specifically for the Atlantic ones, the concern here is that they might not be able to find the food, but also just that the changes in distribution of the prey means that the whales themselves are going to be more unpredictable in terms of where we find them, which means it's harder to protect them. Because again, as we've talked about in previous podcasts, these are 3D animals moving in a 3D environment, and it can be really hard to protect them when they're crossing borders, when they're crossing international waters. Like it's a difficult process.
Well, and even
so
in
if
the
we
North,
don't know where
North
they are as
Atlantic,
frequently.
yeah, in the North Atlantic, they there's a part of the year they have no idea where they are.
Right, exactly. And so if we don't know where they are when we normally know where they are, that's an even bigger problem.
Like they're there, and then they're there, but we don't know where they're in the middle of that, where they went. Like,
Right. And this is the same issue for the North Pacific right whales. Again, the zooplankton distribution is changing because of the sea ice coverage shifts that are happening in their particular environment. And the timing of when they're there is shifting as well, which again, that it's not so much of an issue of knowing where they are, because we don't really know where they are most of the time anyway. This is more to do with just them not knowing where the prey is, and just the stress and starvation that could result from that. And again, similar threat to the southern right whales.
Right.
Another anthropogenic one is ocean noise. So again, if you're in these areas of heavily trafficked shipping lanes, just the general recreational traffic, as we've discussed in other podcasts as well, this increase in background noise affects communication, especially for these animals that use low frequency calls. That can be particularly problematic when we're talking about larger vessels, where the frequency of the vessel itself is lower frequency. And this can increase stress rates. There have been several studies on other types of whale that show that vessel noise actually does increase stress hormones in these animals when they're exposed for long periods of time. So again, it might not be an immediate risk, but it is one that may have implications for the health status of these animals and potentially the reproductive status as well over time. Might encourage displacement too from these foraging or breeding grounds. And that's for all three species that's an issue for. The next one is kind of interesting. So it's actually biotoxins from algal blooms. So this is one that I found for the North Atlantic and the North Pacific specifically. I think it might be a problem in the southern right whale as well, but I specifically was finding this for the northern species. So this has been documented in North Atlantic right whales and in bowhead whales, which again, like I mentioned before, have kind of been used as a proxy for what threats might occur for the North Pacific right whales, because we just don't know as much about them. And it is thought that the increasing levels of domoic acid and saxitoxin that can be produced by some of these algal blooms may actually contribute to ship strikes and entanglement, because it actually messes with the neurotransmitters of the animals, and you're just not as healthy. So again, you can't move as quickly. You might be acting out of, quote unquote, out of character, a little bit less risk averse. I know they've documented that in domoic acid poisoning in like sea lions, for example.
Yeah, and
They
isn't in
start
sea
to show
lions,
weird behaviors.
they show like neurological issues, like
Yes.
they're not acting right. So if that's happening with them, yeah, that certainly could be like they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're just less able to function around some of the, navigate around some of these obstacles in the water column too, if we're talking about fishing gear and that type of thing, or navigating around vessels.
Well, you can kind of think of it of like if you've ever taken had to take painkillers, or like really strong painkillers or something for going in for surgery or something like that. Like you're kind of loopy. Like you're not gonna be able to walk down the street normally. You could fall off the curb and hurt yourself, It's like same kind of foggy.
Yeah, exactly. And then specifically for the southern right whales, which is interesting, and I think we actually had talked about this in a previous podcast, which is fun. So they, again, like I said, all of the other threats that we've already talked about are present, but also specifically for these guys, actually they are known to be attacked by kelp gulls, which we've talked about in another podcast, where they will literally dive bomb the whales and take like chunks out of their skin. So again, we don't know if this really makes a difference to their lifespan or their reproduction, but it can't be pleasant. And it is harassment basically of these animals. And the southern right whales are also known to be predated upon by killer whales and large sharks. Because again, we're talking about being off the coast of Australian waters where you have those big great whites around. So these guys are more frequently predated upon, and they've seen more predation attempts down there. So with that, all those depressing threats, let's move to some fun facts.
Wait, one thing before I go into that, for the North Pacific, I specifically saw that they stopped whaling them in the, I was like 30s or 40s, something like that. But that illegal Soviet whaling was what decimated the Pacific.
Continued to,
in specific, yeah. They did it for for a while, and they killed, you know, a lot of animals. So even like everybody decided we're not going to kill these guys, and then some people decided to still kill them, and that what's really for the Pacific side, at least the Eastern Pacific, was really decimated. So that's again that problem.
And that's
of
also,
like,
I mean,
go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say those ones are unfortunately the ones that are most at risk from climate change too, because of that sea ice change and sea ice
Right.
distribution change. And that's happening very rapidly in that area of the world, unfortunately, due to climate change. So it's like already the most decimated population,
And they
that's
have
kind
that.
of at most risk from climate change, which we are not doing it. I mean, at least, which we'll go on to talk about, at least the entanglement side of things, we are trying to address.
Yeah.
But climate change is
But-
happening much more slowly.
Yeah, and that's the thing with, like, again, it's we can do as much as we can to protect the animals, but they're going up here, you know, if other people aren't going to do the same thing, it makes it very difficult to really effectively conserve them, because we all have to be on the same page for
Right,
climate change
exactly.
too.
Yeah. Yep. So
Fun
with
facts.
that, yeah,
Fun
fun
facts.
facts. Okay, so we already talked about my first one, right whales, because they were the right whales to kill. In terms of their Latin names, which is kind of fun. So they all have the same first part to the Latin name. So it's Eubelina, which means
True baleen.
good. It means what? Sorry.
True baleen.
True baleen, but also good, which is
okay.
kind of an interesting. But it's like true or good baleen, and then also the North Atlantic right whale's species name is glacialis, which means true whale of ice.
Ooh,
which is very
like
cool.
that.
The North Pacific right whale is Eubelina japonica, and the southern right whale is Eubelina australis. So they're just named after their kind of geographic distribution.
Well, that's not as fun.
I know. So the North Atlantic one was the most dramatic, which we like.
Well, I wonder if that was the first one, and then they realized they had to split these other ones up, and they're like, well, okay, you guys just get named by your
probably,
latitude.
Probably. They're thought to live between 70 or 200 years, and they use earwax.
I know.
They can use earwax of dead animals to determine the age that they were in terms of when they actually died, and it's basically like looking at tree rings. They can see growth rings in the earwax of these
and
animals.
they put the plugs are like huge.
They're huge.
Massive.
Yeah, it's super cool. Go look up earwax in marine mammals. It's fascinating. And they can, I mean, again, it's like tree rings. They can tell all kinds of really cool stuff from the earwax.
I think they can do like stress stuff too, didn't they?
They can, they can see stress levels. I think they can see years of good or bad nutrition. It's fascinating.
Yeah. I saw they can also do it from ear bones and then eye lenses, and I heard about that.
I've heard of the eye lens thing before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
That's cool.
I don't know if it's like true, like what they're looking at in eye lenses, but apparently they can age an animal by it.
Huh. I didn't know that one. That's really interesting.
They do the fish or the ear bones in fish all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, the otoliths.
Yeah.
So then speaking to the colossities that were mentioned at the beginning, so one of the really cool things, so these are the only whales known to have colossities on their heads.
Because they're so slow.
Because they're super slow. And they can use these colossities to ID individual animals.
So cool.
Which is awesome. So again, obviously photo ID is kind of our thing here at PacMam. But just one more thing, instead of just like individual, like natural born markings, you can also use these external markings that build up over time to identify individual animals. And because it takes a long time to lay down those colossities, they're not changing super rapidly. So you can still identify the same animals. Yeah. Which I would love to look at a photo ID catalog of right whales. That would just
I've never thought about like how to ID them with that. So you would really need to look at it.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting.
Then I wonder too, are the other whales like, oh, your colossities are so cool looking? Like, does it go into sexual preference of like,
good
I like
question.
the way your colossities are.
Right. I like the configuration of your colossities. Who knows? Good question. And then the most exciting of all, like we already talked about in terms of why we wanted to do this podcast, is that a North Pacific right whale was very recently observed by researchers, like within the last couple of weeks. And we're recording this in late June of 2021. So super exciting. We are actually good friends with another organization who have been looking for the North Pacific right whale for quite some time, Deep Green Wilderness, and they will hopefully be releasing their what looks like incredible documentary. I'm very excited for it. So we'll be letting you guys know when that's released. Talking about the North Pacific right whale.
Yeah, the where they saw it was off Queen Charlotte Islands, which they've renamed to Haida
Haida
Guy. Okay, sorry, I'm
I
gonna
think
say
is
this
how you
wrong.
say it.
Haida Guy. And I was looking up, and I found that they actually saw one in 2018 as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's been acoustic detections off of BC and Washington is like 2013, but it was just super exciting that they got great pictures. They had drone footage of the recent sighting. So.
Yeah, we'll try to link to some of those articles that were published on the Facebook
Yeah.
page of the organization who observed them. So incredible that they're actually still seeing these animals, which I mean is extremely, if you think about the size of the Pacific Ocean, and just how few animals are, it's literally less than a needle in a haystack. I mean, it's extremely difficult to find these animals. So super exciting. And in terms of the entanglement thing, just to end on a happy note, our very good friends at an organization called SMELTS, SMELTS, they are pioneering the development of ropeless technology. So what this means is basically, again, the main issue for especially the North Atlantic right whales is entanglement in fishing lines. If you can develop technology that works consistently so the fishermen aren't losing their catch, they're not out any money, they actually have a more reliable form of technology. Because another issue is that obviously if you're dealing with pots, they can break loose, the fishermen lose them, they can't find them. Okay, well, it's a loss for us, but it's still in the marine environment, right? You're still drifting with that line in the marine environment. So our friends at Smelts are developing this basically completely unique ropeless technology that allows these fishermen to put down their crab pots, their lobster pots, and retrieve them without the use of any lines. So it's all remote sensed. You can tell exactly where your pots are by GPS positioning. They have self-inflating floats that will bring it to the surface for you, so you don't have to haul the line in. And this movement is going to be huge in terms of hopefully reducing that risk to all whales, but specifically the North Atlantic right whale, that is so heavily plagued by this issue.
They're worrying that they could go extinct within the next couple decades. Like
it's
a very real
that
threat.
rapid.
Yeah.
And again, if we think back to the fact that it's, over 85% of the population has been entangled at least once, and they live. So it's, it's a horrible issue, but the great, awesome people at Smelts are really just blazing the trail for this, and ropeless technology is becoming more and more of a talking point. And I know they're branching onto the West Coast here as well.
And there's some other organizations that are trying to do their own version of the ropeless gear, so it's really becoming a momentum.
Yeah, and there are court cases ongoing right now that are trying to move forward the ropeless technology as a viable option. The government's getting behind it, so it's a huge movement. We will link to Smelt's website, so if you guys want to go read more and look at their Facebook page about what they are doing and the type of gear that they're creating, it's incredible.
It's really cool. And we've talked with Rich and his group, and he goes out, and the fishermen are oftentimes very not sure, because it's a new thing, and really is that going to work? And then when he's gone out and it's come up every single time and it's worked, and the fishermen are like, whoa,
right. And so they're getting better return on their catch than they were using the traditional lines, because like I said, you're talking about New England storms, like other vessels going through and breaking your lines, like illegal poaching of lines and pots. So I mean, this is potentially a much more cost-effective solution for the fishermen because they're getting greater return.
And great for the whales.
And it's right, so it benefits every. And we were extremely fortunate to be able to work with Rich. He's one of our good friends, and they developed a ropeless mooring for our passive monitoring device that we were able to deploy just yesterday, actually. So
exciting.
Stay tuned for more. This is kind of one of the very trial I guess ropeless technologies to moor and secure PAM device like ours, but
this is only, as far as we know, the second one that we know of that's in the water anywhere. He put one out over on the East Coast as well. So we're pioneering here in the beginning of using this technology, which is great.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that the uses of this are so much greater than just fishing equipment.
Yep. Right, because otherwise we'd have to put out a line or a buoy to have that acoustic recorder to learn about the animals so that we can help protect them.
Right.
So if we can do that without doing a line.
Yeah, even better. So we will obviously be keeping you guys updated on our specific device. And you can check out our Facebook page at Pacific Mammal Research to see pictures of our deployment yesterday. But just again, a huge thank you to Rich and his team at Smelts for being willing to step into this void that was needed for so long, and actually continuing to work just relentlessly to really push this forward and take the time to talk to the people who really need it the most, who are the fishermen. So with that, that's all.
We are going to talk with Rich later in the year. He's agreed to come on, and so we'll have an interview type podcast later in the year, talking to him about all of this really cool stuff. So that'll be really exciting.
Yeah. So yeah, go check out, like I said, we'll link to their website in the show notes where you can go read more, and they have some really cool infographics on there about how their technology works. So
they do. Yeah, I just actually recently posted the video that they have of how it works and stuff on our Facebook page. So it's very cool.
Yeah. So that's all the right whale.
Yeah, that's the hopeful end of our episode of it working together. We can reduce climate change, and we can reduce these ropes that are in the water, and we can help save these whales and other species as well. So that's it for us this week. Next week we'll do a general review, and then we are gonna again start mixing it up with some interviews later in the summer. The summer is a really busy time for researchers in many places, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. So we'll probably have those after the summer ends. But next time we'll do a general review. And don't forget to check us out on Facebook and Instagram. And next time we promise we will have an Instagram poll for which animal we do for Marine Mammal Highlights. We just got to usurp you this time because it was just so cool that they saw that North Pacific right whale.
Yeah.
They've been literally
looking for everybody knew about it.
Yeah, like they've been looking for years almost, going out and trying to find this. So anyway, that's it for this week, and make sure to join us next time.
Bye.
Bye.
This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To learn more about the species we discuss, check out our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.